Marhaban, welcome, bienvenue. I hope you forgive my emotional voice, but it is actually a very, very happy moment for me and for the team. We are very proud to host this first Science Talk event at the SeaWorld Research and Rescue Center. And I must admit that it's even more exciting because we've seen so much interest for the event. We are supposed to be fully booked. We're still missing a bit of people, but and this happened just 24 hours after putting the announcement online. So I'm very, very glad to see that much interest from the public and from all of you for this event. Thank you all for being here, and again, a warm welcome to the center. I must say that I have dreamed about this series of Science Talk since I've joined the project 2 years ago. But actually, the leadership team before me had already this in mind when designing and creating SeaWorld Abu Dhabi and the center. The vision of Miral and SeaWorld was to create an active hub where the scientific community could not only produce, but also share knowledge on marine sciences and marine conservation. And now we have this wonderful tool, and that allows us to host this event tonight. So I'm truly grateful for the vision of the leadership. And I want to thank as well the Miral leadership, especially for all the support they gave us since the start of this journey. Really, thank you. Finally, I would like as well to thank all the partners with whom we are joining forces to develop these science talks. SeaWorld Research and Rescue is very proud to be part of this vibrant community, and we hope to contribute as much as we can actively and meaningfully to all the educational, scientific, and conservation efforts already existing here in Abu Dhabi Emirates and beyond. So a warm thank you to the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi, of course, Emirates Natural History Group Abu Dhabi, because they've been doing that for a much long time than we are just existing. So thank you for joining forces with us. Nautica Environmental Associates, and of course the soon-to-be Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi. But now I should stop talking because we have a great lineup of speakers tonight. We will hear 3 researchers talking about corals and coral reef ecosystem, and of course, I hope you will enjoy. So, let's start with Dr. Gerrit Nanninga. So, welcome, Gerrit, you can come here. Gerrit joined the research team of the center a bit more than a year ago. He has worked all over the world and carried out his PhD studies in the Red Sea with the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Jeddah. Gerrit's research broadly focuses on the ecology of coral reef, fishes in the Anthropocene, just a vast program. And he agreed nicely to start the talk tonight with a quick introduction on corals and coral reef ecosystem. So thank you all, and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for showing up, and thanks for showing interest. Since I've already been introduced, I will just jump straight into it. I will start this seminar with a very broad and very basic introduction to coral reef ecosystems. And we'll start with the most basic of all questions. What actually is a coral? You've all seen coral reefs either on TV or in nature, but how many of you can confidently tell me what exactly a coral is? See, nobody's daring. 2. We have 2 people that are confident to tell me what exactly a coral is. So let's just quickly go over it. So corals are actually colonial animals. So when you see a coral colony like this, it will consist of hundreds and thousands of tiny polyps that make up this colony. They're all genetically identical and they're all interconnected. And when you take one of these colonies and you cut it in half, you will see that actually only the very top layer is alive. The rest is calcium carbonate skeleton that is deposited by the polyp. And a polyp is somewhat like an upside-down jellyfish. It has tentacles like a jellyfish. The tentacles have stinging cells, and that they can use those to capture prey that is floating past, and they will transport it to their mouth and then digest it in the stomach. Importantly, corals don't live alone. They have tiny single-celled algae living in their tissue, and this is what those look like under a microscope, that are called zooxanthellae. And zooxanthellae are really important because they live in what we call a symbiosis with corals. That means that both the algae and the coral benefit from this relationship. So let's have a closer look. We have the zooxanthellae that live happily in the coral tissue. And because they're algae, they do photosynthesis, thereby producing sugars that serve as food for the coral. In return, the coral produces nutrients that the algae can use, and they provide a nice shelter, a nice home for the coral, for the algae to live. And importantly, a coral receives up to 90% of its energy requirements from the algae, from the sugars that the algae produce via photosynthesis. And in the long run, at least, corals cannot exist without these zooxanthellae. They will starve. Even though they're able to eat food on their own, they require the symbiosis with the zooxanthellae. And just as a side note, corals are not the only animals that live in symbiosis with zooxanthellae. You also find them, for example, in giant clams, sea anemones, or jellyfish. And let's also briefly talk about coral reproduction. It's actually a very complex topic, so we can only scrape the surface here. Corals can actually reproduce asexually and sexually. They can be gonochoric, meaning they have separate sexes. They can also be hermaphrodites. They can even self-fertilize. They can be broadcast spawning or brooding. So here, let's just have a quick look at an example of a broadcast spawning gonochoric species, meaning that we have adult colonies that have separate sexes. They produce eggs and sperm that they release into the water, and in the water column, those will find each other and fuse to form a zygote. After a while, the zygote develops into a so-called planula larva, and the larva spends some species-specific time in the open ocean. And during that time, it is dispersed by ocean currents until it needs to find a place to settle and finally develop into a whole new colony. So even though corals are sessile, meaning they don't move, distant populations are still connected via larval dispersal. Another way that corals reproduce is asexually via fragmentation. So for example, when a piece of the coral breaks off, that fragment, under the right conditions, can grow into a whole new colony. And that process is actually used extensively during coral restoration, and I believe Hammad's going to be talking a bit about that later. We have around 800 species of hard corals, and they come in all sorts of different sizes, shapes, and colors. We have branching corals, columnar corals, foliaceous, massive, and encrusting corals, just to name a few. And together, these colonies, while they grow, form what we know as coral reefs. So overall, we can say that it's a bunch of tiny colonial animals that form the largest living structures on the planet. And we find coral reefs mostly in shallow tropical waters, and that is because A, they like warm waters, not too warm, as we'll see in a minute, but nice and warm enough. And because they rely on photosynthesis, they need high solar radiation. So in a nutshell, that is what corals are, and that is what coral reefs are. But why would we care? They're beautiful, right? But why else do we care? And there's actually a whole range of reasons why we should care about coral reefs. A, because they're hotspots of biodiversity. They only cover a tiny fraction of the sea floor, but they harbor over a quarter of all marine biodiversity. So if we lose coral reefs, we will lose a whole range of biodiversity with it. Also, they're important for shoreline protection. They can reduce wave energy, and they protect vast stretches of tropical shorelines from storm surges, for example. They're also important for fisheries and tourism, and it's been estimated that overall, worldwide, coral reefs produce nearly $400 billion of revenue per year. So they're not only important ecologically, but also economically. But let's stick to the ecology side. So coral reefs are a really diverse system, and sometimes they're referred to as rainforests of the sea. They're actually more diverse even than rainforests. We have around 70,000 or over 70,000 named species on coral reefs, and daily it's becoming more. And that is in part because many organisms that live on the reef are just really good at hiding. They either live close within the reef matrix, so you can't find them, or they're just really good at blending in with their environment. I'm not sure if you can even recognize all of the organisms in these pictures, but there is an organism in each of those. So every day, new species are discovered on coral reefs. And if you're diving on a reef, take a closer look. Might be worth it. Maybe you discover a new species yourself. However, although reefs are so important and so beautiful, they are also among the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. And that is because they're facing a whole range of anthropogenic threats coming from all sides. And we don't have time to go into detail here, unfortunately, but each of these stressors itself has the potential to seriously affect coral reef ecosystems. But typically, they don't come in isolation. They typically work together to affect coral reefs. And in this graphic, I'm not even mentioning the worst threat of all, which is, you might have guessed it, global warming. And this is just to illustrate where we are right now with global warming when we are looking at ocean temperatures. So in this graph, there are several lines showing you the temperature curve across the year. And we're just focusing on a few of them. The dashed line in the middle is the average sea surface temperature in the tropics. The orange line on the top is last year's temperature curve. And the one on the very top, the black thick one, that is this year's temperature curve. And you can see that as of yesterday, actually, we've been over 1.5 degrees warmer than on average over the past few decades. So this is really detrimental to coral reefs because it leads to coral bleaching. And you've probably all heard of coral bleaching. And when you look at it, it actually looks quite nice, almost like it's been snowing on the reef. But when it's happening, it's really dramatic for coral reefs. Well, let's have a closer look at what coral bleaching actually is. So let's look back at that symbiosis between corals and algae. As we said, the zooxanthellae live happily within the coral and supply it with food. However, when we have a heat stress event, sometimes the corals expel the zooxanthellae that live inside them because they become toxic to them. And what happens then is that you see the skeleton of the coral because the tissue of the coral itself is transparent. And what gives the coral its color is the zooxanthellae that live in their tissue. So when a coral bleaches, it just means that it loses their zooxanthellae and you see the coral skeleton underneath the coral tissue. So sometimes when the heat stress subsides, the coral can actually recover. So it's repopulated by zooxanthellae and it can survive. Most of the time, unfortunately, the coral actually dies because it starves. Over time, it will be overgrown by algae, and with more time, it will disintegrate into coral rubble. Unfortunately, once a system has gone through a phase shift like that, it's gone from a healthy system to a coral rubble system, it's very hard for it to come back to a healthy state. It's much easier to go this way than to come back this way. And coral bleaching is not something new. It's not like this has only been happening recently. It's been happening in the past too, but mostly just over small spatial scales in response to local stressors. What we see today, though, is widespread and repeated mass bleaching all over the planet. And actually, as we're speaking right now, there's a global bleaching event happening as we speak, including in the Gulf. So by now, it's been estimated that we have already lost over 50% of global coral cover, and we are on a declining trend. So we really need to act fast to save coral reefs. And people are trying. So there's a whole range of different things that people do to try and save coral reefs. And again, I don't have time to go into detail into all of these different approaches, but one of them, for example, coral gardening and coral nurseries, where people grow corals in protected environments and then they put them back into the wild. That is something that it's happening at large scales all over the world. And again, Hamad is going to be talking about some of the efforts that are happening here in the Gulf in that regard. Also, Trent later is going to be talking about microbiology and maybe some microbial-based approaches to make corals stronger and make them able to withstand heat stress a little better. So there's some light at the end of the tunnel. However, if we want to save coral reefs, this will not be enough. We will actually need to address climate change first. And with that, I would like to thank you again for coming. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email.
Thank you. Thank you. And actually, I forgot to say at the start, I'm sorry, that we will keep all the questions for the three speakers at the end. So we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please keep your questions in mind for Dr. Gerrit, and you can ask it at the end. All right? Thank you, Gerrit. I want to welcome Hamad Al-Jelani. Hamad is an Emirati scientist, part of the EAD team. He graduated from Zayed University and is now assistant scientist in the marine habitat team for the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi. He has been connected to the sea from a very young age and has a strong interest in its well-being and longevity. His work includes monitoring and assessing marine habitats from coral reefs to mangrove forests, especially those in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. He will be talking about the restoration program and the corals of our Emirates, of the Abu Dhabi waters. And so I welcome Hamad on stage for his part. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Hamad Al-Jelani. I'm a coral specialist at the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi, and today I'll give you a brief overview of coral management and monitoring in Abu Dhabi. So, situated in the southern Gulf, Abu Dhabi has roughly around 502 square kilometers of coral area. Corals are one of the most diverse ecosystems anywhere in the world, even only rivaled by rainforest. Unfortunately, we don't have any rainforest in Abu Dhabi, so corals make up for the most biodiverse and most dense ecosystem in the region by a large margin. Some of the corals found here are some of the toughest in the world. They're able to withstand with ridiculously intense conditions, from high salinity and turbidity and extremely warm seawater temperatures that average around 35 to 36 degrees Celsius in the summer. Therefore, it's a key habitat to protect in Abu Dhabi. Fortunately, these supercorals have their limits. Because of the environment and the added pressure from these harsh conditions, any added pressure can destroy the delicate balance. Man-made threats from coastal development, sedimentation, dredging affects coral reefs, but the major threat comes from, especially in corals in Abu Dhabi, come from climate change. Temperatures have started to exceed past 36 degrees Celsius and almost reaching around 38 degrees Celsius in the past few years. And unfortunately, bleaching events have become more severe and more frequent throughout the years. There are some programs the agency has begun a long time ago when it comes to coral reef management in Abu Dhabi. Coral monitoring from the agency has started all the way back in 2005, where we monitor around 10 coral sites from east to west. The agency has also developed a coral management plan that covers all partners at a national level to help understand and research coral reef ecosystems, as well as improve stakeholder participation and policy development. It also helps raise awareness through knowledge programs and including the public. The agency has also been involved with academia, as we have a cooperation with New York University in the field of coral monitoring, and we've also worked with Zaid University in the field of coral propagation. So what do we do when we monitor coral reefs? In the agency, we've broken it down to 4 phases. The planning phase, in which we prepare our gear and we route the most efficient logistics in terms of going to the field, whether it's fuel, equipment, etc. And then the second phase, which is the field survey, the fun part, in which we go down and dive and actually monitor and take data on the coral reefs itself. When we go back to the lab, what we do is we analyze that data and we try to formulate a proper report. And from these assessment reports is when the management or the government plans a management plan or forms policies based on scientifically backed data. Our survey method is actually quite simple. We use 6 30-meter transects separated by 5 meters by each transect. And we take an image with a fixed quadrat, which is roughly 0.25 meters squared. And each image gives us an idea of what the coral composition or benthic composition of that area is. We end up with roughly 11 images per transect and 66 images per site. And most importantly is that we track temperature. Temperature is by far, especially now in the context of climate change, one of the most important things to track, as it helps us understand how these animals are adapting to the increase in temperature and how they're handling climate change. This is an example of what it looks like to monitor a reef. You can see the tape laid on the ground, which is a line transect, and the PVC quadrat, which captures the image of the reef itself. These are the monitoring stations that encompasses the whole coast of Abu Dhabi, ranging from all the way from the east all the way to the far west, to give us a good idea and a good representation of coral reefs throughout the whole Emirate of Abu Dhabi. And let's look at some numbers. Obviously, logistically, it's a very challenging thing to do, to monitor the whole coast of Abu Dhabi. But we roughly spend around, we travel on the boat around 912 kilometers, and we have a total of 21 dives, and we spend around 9 hours underwater. The total transect length is around 1,980 meters for the coral survey and 420 meters for the seagrass survey. And that ends up with around 824 transect images. Part of the data analysis is we use a web-based program to help us break down the information we collected from the field. In cooperation with New York University, what we try to do is we estimate the amount of live coral in each site, the benthic composition. All these information is very important, especially when you're tracking or monitoring a reef over time, as it helps you understand if there's any change or any dynamic change between coral community. For example, if there's too much algae compared to the corals, or if the coral has decreased in numbers, or etc. Temperature data is obviously the most important thing right now in terms of climate change. We try to track and compare the temperature along different years. A good example is the average seawater temperature in 2020, which was a non-bleaching year, was around 34.7 degrees Celsius, which was actually higher than a bleaching year, which was in 2017, around 34.4. 2021 was a bleaching year, and it was around 35.4 degrees. That's 0.7 degrees increase, so we know that's what pushed the corals to bleach in that year. Another interesting thing we look at is peak temperature. Peak temperature shows you how far temperatures can reach in certain sites. For example, in 2020, the peak temperature was 37.1 in August, and it remained high until the end of September. While in 2021, during the bleaching year, it reached a maximum temperature of 38.8 degrees Celsius. That's an increase of 1.3 degrees Celsius. That's considered the highest temperature ever recorded since our monitoring program started in 2005. And it was in Batina Island on August 13th, 2021. So what's our reaction to this bleaching events and loss in coral area? In 2001, under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Zayed bin Hamdan Al Nahyan, the agency launched the Coral Reef Restoration Program, which aims to establish the region's largest coral nursery as a direct action to counteract the negative impact of climate change. The project's objective is broken into 3 things, which is to rehabilitate damaged coral reef in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, to focus on reducing the impact of climate change by focusing on resiliency, and also to increase the coral habitat area in Abu Dhabi. So how is this done? It's done through something we call active restoration through adaptation. First of all, we try to identify the coral fragments that have managed to survive back-to-back bleaching events. We know that they're very resilient and strong and can handle the stress of increased temperatures. From there, we select them and we fragment them and we move them to the coral nursery. In the coral nursery, we try to give them the best conditions to thrive, which includes strong currents, clear water, good nutrients, etc. While they grow in the nursery, we try to aim for looking at areas that require rehabilitation, coral reef areas that have a chance to come back and could use help for more resilient corals. From there, we identify these degraded reefs, and then we fragment our corals and return them back to these reefs. And we monitor them over time to see how they've integrated within that reef. The project has been broken down into 3 phases. Phase 1 is choosing the nursery site and choosing the corals that will be joining the nursery site. The second phase would be fragmenting these corals and putting them back into the degraded reefs, and the last phase would be, obviously, returning them back and monitoring them. So how is the project going so far since 2020? The total number of corals translocated in the nursery since it initiated is around 312,000, which is separated between 4 different sites and covers around an area of 71 hectares. While that's going on, there's still 65,000 coral fragments remain in the nursery. This is by far one of the largest coral restoration efforts ever done in the region, and especially in the Gulf. Man-made threats come from all sides, and unfortunately, climate change is one of them. And that's it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Harman. Okay, so keep your question for later. And now I'm going to welcome our 3rd speaker for the evening. So it's quite a dense, a lot of information coming to us, and I think the information coming to us now will be even more fascinating and maybe new from most of us. So Dr. Trent Hayden is coming from Australia, moved to Abu Dhabi, joined the Dr. John Bird's lab at the New York University, Abu Dhabi, and he's a microbial ecologist interested in coral ecology. And so looking at all the association between microbes and corals, but he will talk about that much better than me in a minute. So I think the main thing is to welcome him on stage and to hear what he has to tell us. Thank you, Trent.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the fascinating world of microbes and their relationships with corals. So when we think of a coral reef, I want you to imagine it's like an oasis in a desert. And what I mean by that is that coral reefs generally shouldn't really survive in these types of environments because they're crystal clear waters that are generally quite nutrient depleted. And it was always considered for a long time to be a bit of a paradox that these corals are surviving in these environments. And the only reason they're actually able to survive in pretty much barren seas is because of their relationships they have with microbes. So corals associate with a number of different microbes. You've just heard earlier about the symbiosis they form with a single-celled algal cell. But on top of that, they also form relationships with other types of microbes, such as viruses and archaea. You heard that the algal symbiont photosynthesizes, produces sugars that the coral feeds on, and in return, the algal symbiont is provided with a safe place to live. But the coral is also providing it with nutrients that it needs to grow and survive in this host organism. But none of this would be possible without introducing bacteria. So bacteria are extremely important within the coral host because a lot of the nutrients that are provided by the algal symbiont, or vice versa, from the host to the algal symbiont, are not given in available forms. So we need bacteria to break them down into more available forms that they can both use. So if you take bacteria out of the equation, this relationship doesn't work anymore. So how do we study the coral microbiome? Well, initially, we would take a small fragment of coral, we'd remove the tissue, and we'd spread it across an agar plate on a petri dish. And the agar is basically full of all these nutrients and salts that bacteria need to grow. And each one of these little dots on this plate represents a different type of bacteria. So we can pick off that colony of bacteria. So it's basically millions of the same genetically similar bacteria, but again, everyone is different. We'll take one of these off, we'll extract the DNA, and then we'll use a process called sequencing, where we decode the DNA, and we can identify what types of microbes are there. So this is, as you can imagine, a pretty long process, because we can only do one at a time. But then, recently, over the last decade or so, a new technology became available, which is called next-generation sequencing. And what this allowed us to do is the same process of removing a piece of coral, removing the tissue, and extracting the DNA, but now we can sequence it all together. So every single microbe that's present in that coral can be detected by this machine at the same time. And that was a breakthrough technology, and it opened our eyes to a much more diverse world of microbes than we could have ever imagined. So corals actually, and many other host organisms, associate with thousands of different types of bacteria and other microbes. And the reason we thought that it was so much lower before is because when we grow them on these, we culture them on these plates, there's only very few, it's actually less than 1% that will actually grow on these nutrients, because each type of bacteria is doing something different and metabolizes a different type of nutrient. And after about 2 decades of research now, so early 2000s, the coral microbiome was starting to be explored. We've now defined most of the members that are there, and we've got a pretty good idea of what they do as well. But there's still a lot of work to be done. So I mentioned earlier, they're essential for providing essential nutrients and vitamins to maintain the health of the coral and the symbiont, but they also protect them from pathogens, which are other microbes that can cause diseases. And how they do this is the coral actually produces this gelatinous-style film, which we call coral mucus, around its skeleton. And within the coral mucus, we find a diversity of beneficial bacteria that actually produce antimicrobial compounds, so like antibiotics. And they'll actually protect the coral from these nasty bacteria that they obviously don't want to associate with. On top of that, they're also involved in metabolizing a lot of dangerous waste products that the coral could otherwise not dispose of. And more recently, we've started to discover their importance, potential importance, but we're pretty certain we're on the right path, that these microbes are actually involved in enhancing corals' resilience to different stresses. As you've just heard about, especially in this region, heat stress is a major problem. So a healthy coral, as you've seen, associates with these algal symbionts, which provides them with all their food. Under normal conditions, they also maintain a diverse microbiome of many different types of bacteria. But we also discovered something else, that corals contain what we call a core microbiome. And the core microbiome is basically an assortment of beneficial microbes that are always present. No matter if we see any changes in temperature, well, let's say temperature at a low level, so seasonal changes, the same beneficial microbes are there. And they're obviously the ones that we consider to be the most important. And if the coral loses them, then they'll possibly see a decline in their health. So as you know already, the threat of rising seawater temperatures to corals is something that we're faced with currently. When this happens, a coral bleaches. As it was explained earlier, they lose their algal symbionts, but they also lose their core microbes. And this is when their health really starts to decline. They've lost their only source of nutrition from the symbionts. They've lost the microbes that are able to transfer these nutrients back to the host. Huge reduction in any healthy functions that they're able to maintain. And they also become increasingly susceptible to disease. They become increasingly susceptible to disease because they've also lost those microbes that are really important in keeping those nasty bacteria away. And when corals are stressed, we've also found that they produce a really different chemical signature. And this chemical signature is exudated into the surrounding seawater. And it can actually be detected by bacteria that can detect a chemical gradient, and the ones that have the ability to swim can actually swim towards these stress compounds. And again, I'm going to explain what this actually does to the coral. So we've run some experiments. This little device you can see on the left here, it basically fits in the palm of your hand. And inside, we can use the stress compounds that we know a coral produces. We can inject them into the wells, and the chemicals will slowly diffuse out of the wells. Then you can see on the other picture on the right-hand side, we can very delicately lower these devices into a reef, fill it up with seawater, the seawater that's maintained directly around a coral, and then we can just leave it sitting there for an hour or so. And all the microbes that are present in the seawater will swim to a chemical of their preference. And when we've tested this against the stress compounds that a coral produces and the more healthy chemicals that a healthy coral produces, we find unequivocally that the pathogenic bacteria prefer the coral stress chemicals. So this is one of the main causes of disease that these bacteria can actually detect and find their way in when a coral is most vulnerable. I don't want to just talk about all the doom and gloom of corals. There, as we mentioned earlier, there is some hope as well. So some of our other research, and a lot of other researchers around the globe, are looking for other solutions of how we can enhance corals' resilience to be able to withstand higher temperatures than what they're normally used to. So one of the ways to do this is we're looking at probiotic treatments. So we're basically trying to find the microbes, again, that we think are the most important, that will maintain a coral's health. And we can pick and choose from all these different bacteria that we're able to isolate. And then we need to define their functions and figure out a way to put them all together in a way that's going to enhance the resilience of the coral. So currently we've done this. We've applied these probiotic treatments to corals, and then we've tested them in under stress conditions versus non-stress conditions. And we have noticed something, that the corals that are treated with the probiotics beforehand are definitely more resilient to heat stress. So this is one method we can use. This has so far only been done in a laboratory, so we haven't applied it to the field. But the hope is that we can grow these corals with these probiotics. We need to make sure that they can hold on to these probiotics over time. And then we can transplant them back onto reefs that have been degraded. And they may have a better chance at surviving through climate change scenarios. But I do want to stress that this is a solution which can improve a coral's ability to face global warming, but only at a very small scale. And it may be able to be scaled up into the future, but as you've heard already, the best way that we can protect our coral reefs is to reduce greenhouse emissions and hopefully lower those seawater temperatures. Thank you.
Okay, so it seems we have one question over the side. You had a question?
How long does this research normally take?
He wants to know how long does the research normally take?
This is for trend, where we
Can all go across. Sure. That's a really good question. So it depends on the question we're trying to answer. Some are more simple than others. But to give you an idea, it's more like years than months. So when we begin with the idea of a question we want to pursue, a hypothesis that we want to pursue, it's probably another couple years before we see an output from that. It takes a long time. As scientists, we want to be sure about the information we're providing to people, and we spend a lot of time just trying to ensure that our results are exactly what we thought they were.
Some projects actually take decades, literally. When people want to observe long-term trends, for example, it takes 20, 30 years to get a final result.
When it comes to monitoring, once we monitor a reef and we get all the data, it can take anywhere from 1 to 2 months to make a report on the status of the coral. But to understand the trends that happens over time can take many years.
Any other questions?
So my question is, how can we as individuals help protect corals, not as specialists or scientists?
That's a very good question. As Garrett mentioned before, we can reduce our carbon footprint as people. We can help push for policies that is more green and sustainable. And as individuals, you can also be citizens in science. So you can be swimming and snorkeling at a reef and say you see something weird or strange. You can report that and let us know that there's something strange in the reef.
To you, since we are open, discussion open, do you want to talk about reef check, for example?
So there is a number of citizen science programs. So one of them that we do is reef check, and we monitor the coral reefs, the fish, and subspecies as well. So there's those, and there's also Coral Watch, where we can also look at the colour of the corals and match the health with a diagram. So there's just small things as divers that we can do to help, and also obviously reduce your emissions.
A few very quick things that everybody can do is just be more aware of your consumption, I guess. Eat less meat, travel less if you don't have to. Just don't leave your water running for hours and hours. Essentially, just consume less. That would help the planet already.
Hi, my question is specifically on this Arabian Gulf. We have a very shallow sea floor and very busy area, a lot of jack-up rigs, many explorations are happening. So most of these sessions they are specializing on, the concern was on global warming. So what about oil spill and sedimentation due to seafloor activities of oil drilling, and specifically on this localized data?
I think Lumna can answer the question. What comes to Adnak? Kan يسأل, and he was asking about oil spill and Yeah. When it comes to, and also exploration, oil exploration.
Hi, my name is Lubna. I work with my team here in ADNOC headquarters. So mainly in ADNOC, we have lots of procedure. We have a standard that's been developed by ADNOC specifically for combating oil spill. Part of it, we are focusing on the EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. It should be there. A very stringent measure is taken before, during, and after each project. Either the project is a drilling, exploration, testing, even the ships that goes, carry our gas and oil to outside the country. We have also aligned with the International Maritime Organization standard, and based on that, we develop more stringent standard and regulation within ADNOC that signature our operation within gas and oil and petrochemical. We do that.
Have you guys found any mutations in sequences that could help favor coral survival?
So we haven't. It's hard. So the work that I do, I generally work more on microbes than genetics, but we do some work on genetics. Mutations obviously happen over really long periods of time, so it's quite hard to detect over years. But having said that, I can't remember if I mentioned, but I definitely wanted to, is that microbes actually evolve at a very fast pace, as you can imagine. So you can grow up a colony of microbes within a day, and they generally have a 24, 48-hour life cycle. So if you imagine, you compare that to the life cycle of a coral, which can be decades, we can see mutations if we can grow bacteria in different conditions, and we will see mutations in their DNA over months, maybe. And now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the tool CRISPR, we can actually edit the DNA, and that is another area of research that we didn't go into, that a lot of people are interested in. For microbes, it's very easy to do. It's a little bit harder to do on a coral animal. But yeah, great question.
But people are actually trying that. They're trying to find good genotypes in corals and trying to find the genes specifically that are responsible for that. And if they do, they can now try and insert that into other corals to make them more resistant.
Yeah, I have a question regarding this year's bleaching event. When you compare it to 2021, was it the same extent? And what happened last year? Last year you could not follow this increase in seawater temperature. So I wonder how is this progress in warming going, and maybe you can explain it a little bit more regarding the Gulf. We have just recently found 2 dead turtles, presumably green turtles, and they are also very much affected due to their feeding behavior of the warming of the Gulf. So maybe you can explain a little bit how it was this year, which extent, and why not last year.
I can give a brief timeline of especially the most recent bleaching events. The most severe one we've had recently was in 2017, which roughly wiped out around 60% of our corals, 63, 64. 2021 was another strong bleaching event. It wasn't as long as the 2017. The heating period wasn't as long as the 2017, but the heat spike was sharper. So the temperature spike was higher for a shorter period of time. We believe that this year's bleaching event is, I think, slightly less severe, at least what we've seen in Abu Dhabi, compared to 2021, but we won't know for sure until after we do our surveys, which we'll do in October after the summer. What I can say is that when it comes to, it's very similar to the 2021, and that we've seen also a lot of green dead turtles. The exact reason why, especially it's large green turtles, the exact reason why is not clear, but there might be something to do with their beneficial bacteria in their stomach, so they're not able to digest food, but that's not determined yet. Compared to last year was actually considered a cool summer. One interesting fact about bleaching events here, they're driven by wind. So if there's no wind in the summer, most often than not, we will get a bleaching event. So last year in 2022, we had a lot of shamal, northwesterly winds, and seheli, which is southeasterly winds. This year, we kind of knew we might have gotten, or we might be getting a bleaching event by early to mid-July, when we realized that there was not much wind coming. So we were kind of expecting maybe a mild bleaching event, but so far, I'd say it's almost like the 2021.
How fast is the coral dying?
When it has bleached, you mean?
Yes.
That depends. It depends on the coral species, it depends on the environment. Actually, I just learned today that corals in the Gulf apparently take a lot longer to die. Maybe because they're better at feeding themselves actively, because as I said, they can actually capture prey from the environment and feed on it. And maybe some corals are better at this than others, so they can survive longer. But you can't say there's like a day or 5 hours and then the coral dies. It depends on the circumstances and the coral itself.
Hi. We grew up hearing this story that a lot of beautiful islands around the world, like the Maldives and the Polynesian, have been created by special fish like parrot and pufferfish feeding on corals. How true is that?
Well, it's true. If you're standing on a beautiful white tropical beach, it's mostly going to be made up of parrotfish poop. That is correct. Because they feed a lot on corals, and then in their stomach, they just kind of clean it up and they transport it to different environments. So they're really important bioeroders, but also they're really responsible for a lot of movement of this material on reef systems.
Also, when they feed on the corals, they fragment the corals and it spreads a little bit on the reef.
So parrotfish are really important anyway because they also feed on algae, and that is really important because corals compete with algae for space. And if you remove all the fish that feed on the algae, the corals are outcompeted, essentially. So that's why overfishing is such a big problem. One of the reasons.
Yeah.
Hi, I would like to understand what kind of restoration projects is SeaWorld currently undergoing and how can we support? And also, second question, for the coral nurseries, how are you guys outplanting the corals that, is growing too big for the coral nurseries? Thank you.
You can go ahead.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So when it comes to SeaWorld, we hope to join together and initiate something called the Coral Rescue Program. So in events like these, where we have high bleaching or high seawater temperature, we have a chance of, let's say, taking a few of our corals out of the water to conserve their genetic resiliency and keep it as a gene bank, basically, as well as having experiments to make them stronger. When it comes to the coral nursery, when the corals grow really big, when we return them back to the degraded reef, we actually break them into smaller pieces. That's believed to actually make them even stronger. As fragmenting coral, it's like basically a similar concept to if you break or fracture a bone, and when it heals up, it gets a little bit stronger. And that's something in a concept like that.
And yeah, so, well, regarding just the first part of the question, I think this is we have ongoing or plan on working together with the EAT for restoration project, but mostly we're starting as well research on coral reef ecosystem in general. So, yeah.
Okay. Hi. My name is Mariam, and I'm from ADNOC, working with the biodiversity core team. So my question is, how much information do we know about coral reef in our region, specifically in UAE, and compare it to the current available data globally?
There's quite a lot of literature on coral reefs, but a lot of it is very recent, especially within the last, let's say, 30 years. But there's still more to find out, because the corals here are pretty much different than any corals around the world. Like as mentioned before, they're able to withstand harsh conditions. They can even stay bleached for a very long time compared to other corals around the world. So that's something that we don't quite understand yet at a scientific level.
I don't know, Trent, do you want to, because you're coming from Australia where we've been, or you've been, not you, but the Australians have been studying the Great Barrier Reef for a very long time, so can you just give a comparison of...
Sure. So it's a very different environment, obviously. The coral reefs here, because this is the hottest body of seawater in the world, the tolerance that they're able to withstand is absolutely astonishing, even though we are getting bleaching at the moment, and we've had in the past. So generally, a typical coral reef, such as the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, their corals cannot withstand temperatures above 31, 32 degrees. Their threshold sits at 32 degrees. Here in the Gulf, we see the corals doing fine around 34, 35 degrees. It's absolutely amazing to see that. That's why it's of a lot of interest for us to study these corals and try and understand why. In terms of bleaching, yes, we've already seen at the moment, I think we expect it started about mid-July. So it's been going on for a couple months, and there's still a lot of corals persisting quite well, even though they're bleached. Whereas in Australia, no, we wouldn't think that corals would survive for that long while bleached. They'll starve because they're not getting the nutrients they need from photosynthesis because they've lost all their algae. But here, that's definitely a topic of interest, is trying to understand how they're able to withstand the bleaching for such long periods of time.
And I think we're...
So what other animals do corals eat besides like little animals, like micro animals?
Like what does the coral eat, or what eats corals?
No, like what other animals do
they eat? What animals do they eat?
They feed on, I think, basically everything that floats past, that they can get their hands on that is edible. Little planktonic organisms, and they can use their stinging cells. I don't know if you've ever touched jellyfish, but some of the species of jellyfish, it really hurts when you touch them. It's because they have these stinging cells that shoot a little poisonous dart in your skin. And corals are able to do that too. It doesn't really hurt when you touch a coral, but when it's a tiny microscopic organism, it can actually capture that organism like that and then transport it to its mouth and eat it. So it's mostly small particles and small, tiny animals in the plankton that they feed on.
All right, 3 more questions. We could stay for hours, I guess, but yeah.
My question is, like, from an evolutionary standpoint, what is the nearest ancestor to corals? And also, what exactly makes them and puts them in the animal kingdom?
Oh, that's a good question. I would need I don't have my phylogenetic tree in front of me right now, but I would say it's probably, they are closely related to jellyfish, as I said in the talk. They're essentially upside-down jellyfish. Their body plan is very similar to a jellyfish. I don't know if that's the closest related.
No.
To be honest, I do not know.
Yeah, taxonomy is definitely not my strong point either, but they come from a group called Cnidarians.
Yes.
And within cnidarians, corals are a branch, a different genetic branch to jellyfish, but they've evolved from a similar organism. I can't think of it offhand right now, but yeah.
Thanks for that question. Thanks.
Yeah, at the back? Yes, perfect.
Does the plastic affect the growth of the corals?
Who was that? Hi.
Hi.
Yes, it can, definitely. So there have been different studies on, for example, microplastics. So plastics in the ocean break up into tiny, tiny pieces. They become smaller and smaller over time. And in the end, they actually become nanoplastics. They're so small, they can even go through cell walls. So they're everywhere. And microplastics can affect corals. That can affect their feeding. And we've just been talking about feeding. They can mistake those particles for food and take them in. And it creates a false feeling of satiation. So the coral thinks it has been eating plenty, but in reality, it's only been eating essentially poison. Another way in which plastics are really detrimental is larger plastics, like plastic bags. They smother the reef. They sink down on top of a coral, and it just simply smothers the coral, and it dies. Most of the plastic that we find in the ocean is actually fishing nets. Like discarded fishing gear is that's the highest proportion of plastics we find in the ocean. And that, like so-called ghost nets that also sink down on top of the coral, and it just by rubbing on top of the coral, it destroys corals. Corals are very fragile. If you're ever on a reef, don't touch a coral because it will very quickly die, even if you just gently touch it. So if you have a fishing net on top of a reef that's moving around in the current, it destroys a lot of coral. So plastic, yes, it does affect corals.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Yeah.
All right, we may have more than 3 more questions. Sorry, too many questions. Yes.
Hey guys. Oh my God. So just a quick one with regards to the treatment with microbe introduction. So you mentioned the uncertainty of the treatment's longevity. And I was just wondering if this is an impact, or if this is impacted by corals rejecting the culture that's introduced, or if it's just a natural decline in its effectiveness. And just with that as well, how viable is this as a solution for coral preservation as well, if you compare it to the likes of, let's say, the nurseries or other relocation programs?
Yeah, great question. So basically, we're in very early stages of this at the moment, so I can't give you all the answers, but the way the bacterial communities sort of function within a coral is they're sort of there on a basis whether, such as we've heard about symbiosis. So are they needed for something? Is there something present in the coral that they can metabolize on? And there's certainly some bacteria that can and will stay. One of the tricky parts is with environmental change. As I sort of mentioned, the community shift. But there are a few that we've discovered now that seem to be constantly present in almost every single species of coral. So these are the ones that we're working on now and trying to describe their functions and what we think they'll do. So we do believe that they will be able to hold on to them for long periods. The question, I suppose, is do they require multiple treatments? And then again, as I mentioned, bacteria can evolve at a really fast pace. So if we keep applying them back to the coral, they will evolve to like that environment. And the second part of the question, I've forgotten it was...
Just a quick one on that as well.
Restoration, I remember now.
So it's find it naturally in the coral, and this is something that you selected already to maybe reintroduce it.
Correct. So at the moment, these are microbes that we find naturally in corals. And exactly, we increase the concentration of what's given to that coral. So that coral might have gone through a stage at one time in its life where it's lost some of those beneficial bacteria and it can't get them back. So basically, we're sort of trying to do it in a way where we're just helping the natural cycle. Because obviously, one thing we definitely don't want to be doing is taking microbes from some other environment, putting them into coral, and who knows what that's going to do to the rest of the environment or the ecosystem. So yeah, it's got to be on a natural basis. So yeah, you're really just enhancing what's already there, but in a way kind of teaching the coral and the microbes to form a bond and be able to be more stable. And the way microbial ecology works, we see shifts in different types of bacteria because something else is competing against it. So it's always a constant competition. And the idea is that, as you said, we'll just overload it with a high concentration. They'll be able to outcompete the other bacteria that may not be doing much for the coral. I was just going to quickly get back to the rest of your question. I remembered about restoration. So the answer is we need everything we can. We need to throw everything we can at this question of trying to hold on to and protect coral reefs. So whether it's probiotics, whether it's coral restoration, everything we can throw at it is at the moment the answer for sure. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Brigitte Hauer from the Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi. Thank you so much for absolutely amazing talks. And probiotics for corals, I mean, that just blows my mind. What I wanted to ask you, though, is that I know a few years ago we were very concerned that many corals around the world were dying. But our corals are so special here in the UAE because they can withstand the ranges. So I remember there was talk of maybe using some of our coral stock to try and rehabilitate other reefs. I'm just wondering whether that's actually happening now or whether there is anybody who can speak to that.
Okay. I'll just add one quick thing while it's on my mind about that. Interestingly, so the short answer is yes, but there is something we've done before where if you take the corals here live it also in a really high saline environment, and we've tried already to take corals from here into an area that's less salty, like the east in Fujairah, and the corals don't do very well there because of the difference in salinity. So for heat stress, yes, certainly. But there are other environmental factors that we need to think about whether that could be possible or not. So it depends where they're going and how similar that environment is.
It's also a bit multifaceted in that it's not just the coral itself. I think the zoothely in the Gulf is also different than the zoothely that's outside the Gulf. As you mentioned before, the salinity plays a role. Also, if you take these corals for a long time outside the Gulf, or say you keep it in an aquarium and put it back, they won't be the same. They have to be in that environment for a long time.
It's also not really the solution. We can't just take corals from the Gulf and plant them all over the world to restock reefs, because then we have no more corals left here. So what we can try to do is find what makes these corals so resistant and resilient. Is it genetics, physiology, behavior even, or probiotics? So, and then try and apply that to other corals, but that is also very tricky. How can you scale that up? You can ingest, insert certain genes into a specific corals. That's possible, but how do you scale that up to actually make a difference? That is very tricky questions. But we are actually working on trying to find out what makes those corals so resilient here. So we do have planned experiments, hopefully soon starting, they're actually trying to answer exactly these types of questions.
And I think I want to add to that actually there are, and it's true, there are a lot of teams all over the world, researchers from elsewhere, very interested in coming to help. And because I think we were talking earlier about how much data, how much knowledge do we have, actually not that much, and there are so many more questions to answer. So we are, all the teams here are studying the corals of the Gulf, but we have also other teams from other parts of the world coming here and very interested in understanding or helping understanding what's going on. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Mark Beach, also from Natural History Museum. None of you really mentioned much about artificial reefs. I mean, I've been in the Emirates a long time now, 30 years, and the municipality used to try sinking different concrete domes. I think EAD was doing some experiments with artificial reefs and things. I know the fashion now seems to be more about having coral nurseries and translocation, but is this idea abandoned now because you still see piles? I know Fujairah municipality on the East Coast, they were sinking some and they were trying different designs of different domes and cavities. I was never very happy about that idea. And I know in Qatar they were sinking car wrecks to create what they called artificial reefs. And the fishermen just knew the location of these and would fish out all the large fish that would aggregate near some of these new places. And so there are obviously problems with that. But is this pretty much abandoned now, this idea of sinking in things to stimulate reefs? Because I know the materials are not very suitable sometimes that they sink on.
I can answer that question, yeah. So the policy right now, especially in Abu Dhabi, is that we're trying to stay away from dumping anything in the sea. When you look at a reef, especially a coral reef, you want to look at it as a whole system. So it's not just the corals. It's the corals, the invertebrates, the fish. So you can, say, dump some metal pieces here and there, and sometimes it might not capture coral larvae, sometimes it might, but one thing it will do, it will take away some of the fish that are meant to be in the reef, like the algae eaters that are supposed to support the reefs by eating the algae, and pull them all the way into the, basically it competes with the natural reef. So I think a more nature-based solution is more appropriate.
Yeah, Garrett?
I mean, yeah, just randomly dumping concrete structures in the water, that should be not the way to go. Although artificial reefs are not entirely useless, and the criticism that fishermen go and take out the fish, I don't think that's really valid. If you put in artificial reefs, then obviously protect them properly, and then they actually can serve a good purpose, because that is, a lot of that is missing here in the Gulf. We have a lot of soft substrate that is not suitable for coral settlement. So if you provide them with a suitable settlement space, that can actually help. I mean, obviously, it needs to be planned well. Where do you put it? In what kind of form? How is it going to be protected, and how is it going to be monitored? But it's not abandoned entirely. It's still happening, yes.
All right.
Yes.
Last question, I think.
Here?
Okay, yeah.
Yes, I would
Not
like to go
last
back about the genetic engineering. You gave us very nice tips, but for example, we were able to get genes from the fish that are surviving in very extreme low temperatures and put in plants. And these plants now, they can survive when these scenarios of low temperature are happening. So my question is, how hard is to replicate this technique to this specific organism? Because in case we are not able to decrease this global warming, maybe we need to give this extra power to this organism. So how hard is this technique to apply for this coral? Thank you.
So there actually has been some recent research in this area where they've done some gene editing on the coral genome. Again, so it's possible. You need to obviously identify the genes that you're trying to insert or remove, to which I don't think we're quite there yet in understanding the roles, specific roles of everything. And the other issue is sort of, as I mentioned before, that we want to be very careful throwing essentially a GMO into an environment, and we don't know how that's going to propagate into the future. So I mean, there's no plans of any of this happening that I'm aware of in the UAE. There has been talk of it in Australia, but the government is very, we need a lot of approvals to do anything, and the government is very wary of allowing that to happen. So currently this takes place in aquariums where everything's isolated and we can sort of control the system. So I would say it requires a lot more work before that's a viable solution.
And you already have resistant genotypes out there. So rather than inventing new supercorals artificially, we should probably take advantage of those corals that are already out there and try and crossbreed them to make other corals more resistant. And that's happening, for sure.
And it is working to some degree. I mean, I know there's a bleaching event going on right now, but there is some good news. And one of the good news is the corals that we actually planted aren't bleached or haven't been affected by the bleaching that much. So it shows that there is a chance for them to, withstand these bleaching events.
All right. Last question. And I'm sorry for everyone. I know that we could talk a lot more about corals and with those great speakers, but yeah, last question for tonight. Thank you.
How can we use innovation and technology to conserve a coral reef? And if there is any, can you tell us?
So, innovation and technology.
Yeah, I mean, innovation and technology, I think the first thing, as we all said before, that we need to do is try and stop global warming. That's the first thing, because otherwise none of the rest makes sense. So innovation can come in, for example, in trying to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. But if we're talking about reefs specifically, genetics is definitely a big thing. That, like we just said, people are working hard on trying to find the best genotypes and do crossbreeding, and to try and find good ways to make corals grow fast in nurseries, to try and create resistant corals in nurseries. And there's different calls right now, actually, too, for novel projects to introduce new technologies. And one example that I find very fascinating, for example, is the use of reef sound to attract fishes to artificial reefs. So reef fishes are really important for the reef community, but dead reefs don't sound like healthy reefs. Healthy reefs produce a certain sound. And if you replicate that sound, you can actually attract fish larvae to artificial reefs, so to enhance and speed up community development. So this kind of technology I find, for example, very fascinating.
All right, thank you very much. Again, thank you to the speakers. This was our first science talk. Thank you to everyone here. I wanted to invite some of our partners, and obviously, Hamad, you're here from EAD. But just, again, it's a very, very proud moment for us to have that here at the SeaWorld Research and Rescue Center. But we wanted to thank you as well, all the partners and all everyone who came here. So just wanted to give the microphone to Judith, who is coming from the Natural History Museum, DCT. So here you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would just like to say, obviously, I'm from Natural History Museum, Abu Dhabi, as you kindly said. We are a very new institution, a new museum coming to Abu Dhabi and due to open end of 25, 26. So we're on a very exciting journey right now. But I wanted to say thank you firstly to SeaWorld for inviting us and for partnering with us on this event. This was a really inspirational series of talks tonight, and for us to hear all of this innovative and inspiring research and work that's actually happening around Abu Dhabi, it's great for a museum to hear this, because as some of you might know, what museums can do is we can amplify the stories that are happening, this amazing research and work that's happening there. We can bring that story into the bigger story of the history of the natural world in Abu Dhabi and how that fits into the global story of natural history. So for us to be a part of this, to be involved with SeaWorld, I feel we all have very similar goals to inspire people to look after the world around them and actually try to build a brighter future for everyone. So I want to say thank you, and I hope that we can be involved more in these events. Thanks to all the speakers as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Claudia Stoiber, the chair of the Natural History Group, Abu Dhabi. I'm a geologist myself. The Natural History Groups are the oldest non-governmental groups made of a mix of nature lovers, scientists, and we all put our knowledge together in a basket. We share it, we experience nature together, and I think we are very thankful for this new partnership with SeaWorld and the Rescue Center. And I want to mention also one of SeaWorld here who is busy in the education, Tom Funke, who contacted us already from the United States to become a member of the Natural History Group. So thank you very much for this. And yeah, and it is really, it's so great that we all sit together in events, that we share our experience with this extreme environment, which offers endless possibilities for us to learn. And I think it's great that we can do all these together and do this mix together. And I hope we can continue to do events like this. And I just want to say thank you also to the speakers, because I think it was a great combination of talks with a general introduction, but also more specification, and also with a spot on the local environment here that we should never forget, because we can learn so much in these times of climate change. And also another word, that the audience is a mix between different age people, and that children are allowed to ask questions. This is great. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you all. Well, there is some more refreshments outside, so you can just continue and ask more questions to the speakers. They might stay around, who knows. All right, thank you.